Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to the golden banks of the Nile, to the ancient city of Alexandria, where a queen unlike any other ruled with brilliance, courage, and unmatched intelligence. We'll follow the life of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, her rise to power, her alliances with Caesar and Antony, her triumphs, her struggles, and the enduring legacy that has fascinated the world for centuries. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and allow the story of Cleopatra to carry you gently into a world of history, mystery, and timeless wonder. Be sure to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you can join us for more captivating journeys through history. The year was 356 before the birth of Christ in the northern kingdom of Macedon, a land of rugged hills and fertile valleys, where shepherds tended flocks on rocky slopes and farmers worked the soil that stretched down toward the blue waters of the Aegean. It was not a great empire then, not yet. To the powerful cities of Athens, Thebes, and Sparta, Macedon was little more than a wild frontier, a rough kingdom at the edge of the Greek world. But in the royal palace at Pella, something was stirring, something that would change history forever. On a warm summer night in July, the Queen Olympias labored to bring forth a child. Outside her chambers, the air was heavy with the hum of cicadas, and the flickering light of torches illuminated the stone courtyards. Priests whispered that omens had appeared in the heavens, a blazing star cutting across the sky, its tail like fire. Far away in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a great blaze had broken out, reducing the sacred shrine to ashes. Some said it was a sign that a force of destiny had entered the world. When the cries of the newborn echoed through the palace, the boy was laid in his mother's arms. He was given the name Alexander, meaning defender of men. His father, King Philip II, looked upon him with a soldier's pride. Philip was already a man hardened by wars, his body marked with scars, his one eye blinded by a spear. Yet he smiled when he saw his son, for he believed the omens. This child was destined for greatness. The boy's mother, Olympias, came from Epirus, a land of ancient tribes and fierce traditions. She claimed descent from Achilles, the hero of Homer's Iliad, and she raised her son with stories of gods and warriors, filling his young imagination with visions of glory. She was a proud and fiery woman, deeply devoted to her gods, especially to Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and divine madness. At night, she would tell Alexander that he was not merely the son of Philip, but touched by the divine, born to achieve more than mortal men could dream. The palace at Pella was a place of noise and color, halls filled with guards in bronze helmets, courtiers in long flowing robes, servants hurrying with trays of food and amphorae of wine. The boy grew up surrounded by the sounds of clashing swords in the training grounds, the smell of horses in the royal stables, the voices of poets reciting verses in the banquet halls. Macedon was a land that honored strength above all things, where kings were judged not only by wisdom, but by how well they fought in battle. From his earliest days, Alexander absorbed this spirit, watching his father lead men with authority, watching warriors return bloodied, yet triumphant from the field. And yet, there was more to him than a soldier's son. The boy's eyes, bright, restless, always searching, seemed to hunger for something beyond Macedon, beyond the mountains that ringed his homeland. Even as a child, he would stare for hours at maps carved into wood or painted on parchment, tracing the outlines of distant lands, Persia to the east, Egypt to the south, and the endless sea that stretched toward unknown horizons. Stories of Achilles were his lullabies, tales of Troy his childhood lessons. Olympias whispered to him that he carried the same fire as the hero of old, that his blood was meant to carve new legends into the world. And so, from the first days of his life, Alexander was set apart, marked by his mother's fierce belief and his father's towering ambition. He was not yet a conqueror, not yet a king. He was only a child in the palace of Pella, cradled by a queen, watched over by a warrior king, yet already carrying the weight of prophecy. Outside, the world turned as it always had. The markets bustled. Shepherds tended their flocks. Sailors carried goods across the sea. No one could know that within the small body of the boy born that night, a storm was growing, a storm that would shake empires, topple kings, and carry the name of Alexander to the ends of the earth. The boy who would one day be called Alexander grew in the long shadow of his father, King Philip II of Macedon. Philip was no ordinary monarch. He was a man of fire and iron, a soldier who had carved his throne from chaos. When he inherited the crown, Macedon was weak, torn apart by enemies on all sides. Yet through sheer will, ruthless cunning, and unmatched skill in war, Philip forged an army that was unlike any other in Greece. He was the architect of the phalanx, a wall of men armed with long spears, moving as one body, an unstoppable tide of bronze and wood. Alexander watched his father closely. From the high balconies of the palace at Pella, he would see Philip ride out with his companions, the elite cavalry that thundered across the plains. He saw the way soldiers bent the knee before their king, how men spoke his name with fear and reverence. But he also saw the hardness in Philip's eyes, the scars that spoke of wounds endured, and the endless campaigns that pulled him from hearth and home. Life in the Macedonian court was never peaceful. It was a place of rivalries and whispers, of banquets that ended in quarrels, of marriages forged as weapons of diplomacy. Alexander was the son of Olympias, a proud and formidable queen, but Philip had other wives, other children, each one with claims, each one with ambition. For a boy so young, the palace was a lesson in survival, in watching who smiled too sweetly, who bowed too deeply, who waited for a chance to strike. Olympias kept Alexander close to her, reminding him often that he was destined for greatness. Yet Philip had other ideas. He loved his son, but he was determined that the boy would not grow soft. While Olympias filled Alexander's head with tales of Achilles, Philip put a spear in his hand. By the time he was 10, Alexander could ride a horse, draw a bow, and wield a sword with surprising skill. His small body carried a fierce spirit, one that startled even hardened soldiers. There is a story often told of a horse, wild and untamable, brought before Philip as a gift. The animal reared and bucked, throwing off every rider who dared mount him. The courtiers laughed, saying it was a wasted gift, but the boy Alexander stepped forward. He was only 12, yet his eyes were sharp. He noticed how the horse shied from its own shadow, how it turned with fear whenever the sun struck its flank. Gently, Alexander led the horse toward the light, turned its head toward the sun so the shadow no longer troubled it, and with steady hands, mounted its back. To the astonishment of all, the beast calmed under him, carrying him across the yard with grace and power. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Philip's eyes filled with tears. He embraced his son and is said to have spoken words that would echo across history. "My boy, seek a kingdom equal to yourself, for Macedon is too small for you." From that day, the horse, named Bucephalus, became Alexander's companion, his shadow in battle, his friend through years of conquest. Together they grew, boy and beast, each reflecting the other's untamed spirit. Yet life under Philip was not only lessons of courage, there were darker truths as well. Macedon was a kingdom in constant motion, armies marching, envoys arriving, enemies defeated, yet always replaced by new ones. Alexander saw his father's ruthlessness, how Philip crushed rebellions, how he bent Greek city-states to his will, not only with battle, but with cunning alliances and marriages. He saw that a king's power was built not just on swords, but on suspicion, on strategy, on knowing when to show mercy and when to show none. And he saw too the tension between his mother and father. Olympias despised Philip's other wives, fearing they might supplant her son's claim to the throne. Her whispers filled Alexander's ears at night, telling him never to trust, never to forget that even blood could turn against him. The boy learned early that love and loyalty in a royal court were fragile things, easily broken by ambition. Still, Alexander adored his father, admired the way Philip strode across the world like a colossus. Yet deep within, a flame burned. He did not wish only to follow in Philip's footsteps. He wished to surpass him, to conquer not only Greece, but the world beyond, to carve his name into the memory of mankind, greater even than Achilles, greater than any king who had come before. And so, in the shadow of Philip II, a boy's ambition was born. Quietly, steadily, Alexander prepared himself, absorbing the lessons of war and politics, watching, learning, waiting. He was still a child in Pella, but already his eyes looked far beyond the hills of Macedon, toward the glittering east, where the empire of Persia stretched like a golden horizon. As Alexander entered his teenage years, his father Philip sought not only to make him a warrior, but also a thinker. Macedon's strength was its army, its horses, its iron and bronze. But Philip knew that to rule Greece and perhaps the lands beyond, his son would need more than the sword. He would need the mind of a philosopher, the vision of a statesman, and the wisdom to guide men as well as to command them. So Philip called upon one of the greatest thinkers of the age, Aristotle of Stagira. The philosopher was already known throughout Greece, a student of Plato himself, a man who had studied the mysteries of nature, the workings of politics, and the depths of the human soul. When Philip invited him to tutor his son, it was a union of power and knowledge, a bond between king and philosopher that would shape the destiny of the world. A quiet place was chosen for the lessons, away from the noise of Pella's court, away from the quarrels of queens and generals. In the shaded groves of Myesa, beneath tall trees where cicadas hummed in the summer air, Alexander and a circle of noble boys gathered to hear Aristotle speak. The philosopher wore plain robes, his beard streaked with grey, his eyes sharp with thought. To the young prince, he was not merely a teacher, but a doorway into a new world. Aristotle's lessons were unlike the drills of the training yard. He spoke of the stars that turned above their heads, of the nature of animals and plants, of the laws that governed men and cities. He recited the poetry of Homer, the verses of the Iliad, and explained that within those tales of gods and warriors lay truths about honor, fate, and the fragile thread of human life. For Alexander, it was as if the very universe had opened before him, each word a path leading toward knowledge. The boy loved above all the stories of Achilles. He saw in that hero a reflection of his own restless spirit. Aristotle encouraged this, yet also warned him. Achilles was mighty, but pride was his downfall. A true leader, the philosopher said, must master not only his enemies, but also himself. The lessons were not dry words alone. Aristotle showed the boys how to dissect plants, how to observe the habits of animals, how to think with their eyes as well as their minds. He taught them the principles of logic, the shaping of arguments, the weaving of ideas into speech. In the cool shade of Myesa, Alexander learned not only how to fight, but how to persuade, how to inspire, how to lead with both sword and tongue. But Aristotle also planted deeper seeds, seeds that would shape Alexander's destiny. He taught of the Persian Empire, vast and glittering, stretching from the mountains of Asia Minor to the rivers of India. He spoke of the great cities of the East, of Babylon with its hanging gardens, of Persepolis with its palaces, of the treasures and cultures that lay beyond Greece. To Alexander, these were not mere curiosities. They were a promise, a horizon calling him onward. Still, there were tensions. Aristotle believed in the superiority of Greek culture, that the Hellenes were destined to lead, and that other peoples were meant to follow. Alexander listened, but in his heart he felt differently. Perhaps from his mother Olympias, who came from Epirus, or perhaps from some deeper instinct he believed that all men, Greek or foreign, might share in greatness, that the world could be bound together by something larger than conquest alone. That dream would grow with him, shaped by Aristotle's teachings, but stretching beyond them. There is a story that Alexander once asked Aristotle why men strive for knowledge, why they seek to understand the world. The philosopher answered that wisdom was the highest virtue, the one thing that could guide kings, and shape nations. Alexander is said to have replied that he did not wish merely to know, but to act, to turn wisdom into deeds that would echo through time. It was a boy's answer, yet within it lay the seed of the man he would become. In those years at Mieza, under the gaze of Aristotle, Alexander's mind was sharpened like a blade. He was still a boy, still learning to master his horse, still watching his father wage wars across Greece, but already he carried within him a vision larger than Macedon, larger even than Greece. He would not be content to be a king of hills and valleys. He was beginning to dream of empire, of a world united beneath his name. And so, while the summer winds stirred the leaves of Mieza, while Aristotle's voice echoed in the groves, the boy absorbed lessons of poetry and politics, of logic and life. It was the education of a prince who was destined to become more than a king. It was the shaping of Alexander the Great. By the time Alexander reached his mid-teens, he was no longer simply a prince at lessons or a boy in the training yard. His father, King Philip II, was uniting Greece by both cunning and force, and the young Alexander was drawn into the fire of real campaigns. For Philip, there was no better training for a future king than the taste of dust, sweat, and steel on the battlefield. The Macedonian army was the strongest in the Greek world, a force unlike any other. The phalanx, with its long sarissas, spears so tall they looked like a moving forest, was the heart of it. Behind the phalanx thundered the companion cavalry, noble horsemen who struck like a hammer once the enemy had been pinned. And there, riding with them, learning their discipline and courage, was the young Alexander. At first, he was given small commands, leading a group of soldiers on maneuvers. He studied the way the men marched, how they held formation, how a phalanx could be steady as stone or crumble in chaos if discipline faltered. He learned to read the land, to see the high ground, the hidden paths, the rivers that could aid or hinder an army. Philip watched his son closely, testing him, measuring his ability to act not only with courage, but with judgment. Alexander's first taste of battle came during the campaigns in Thrace, in the wild lands to the north. The enemy there were fierce tribesmen, strong and swift, who fought not in disciplined ranks, but in sudden charges, shouting war cries that echoed in the hills. To the young prince, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. He rode Bucephalus, the great black horse he had tamed, and with spear in hand he followed the charge of the companions. The wind whipped against his face, the ground thundered beneath the hooves, and the clash of men and weapons rang in his ears. In the fury of combat, he showed no fear. He cut down enemies, rallied his men, and fought with a fire that astonished even hardened warriors. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The boy fought like Achilles reborn. When the battle ended, Philip embraced his son before all the soldiers, proud not only of his courage, but of his command. Yet war was not only glory. Alexander also saw its cost. He walked among the wounded, saw men groaning on the ground, their bodies broken. He smelled the iron tang of blood, the smoke of burning villages, the tears of captives led away in chains. These images seared into his mind, teaching him that conquest was built on both triumph and suffering. In the years that followed, Alexander stood at his father's side in ever greater campaigns. He watched Philip crush the Greeks at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Macedon became the master of Hellas. Though only 18, Alexander was given command of the companion cavalry. When the crucial moment came, he led the charge that broke the sacred band of Thebes, the most famous warrior force in Greece. With his spear leveled and Bucephalus beneath him, he drove into their flank, scattering them, proving himself not just a prince, but a commander in his own right. It was there, on that field, that Alexander first felt the intoxicating mix of destiny and danger. He saw men fall before him, heard the cries of defeat, and felt the surge of power that comes when the tide of battle turns by your hand. From that day, the soldiers no longer saw him as a boy. They saw him as a leader, a prince whose courage matched his father's, a warrior touched by the gods. But even in victory, Alexander's thoughts were restless. He looked beyond Greece, beyond Thrace, beyond the mountains. He dreamed of Persia, that great empire across the sea, rich with gold, filled with cities and wonders he had only heard of in Aristotle's lessons. And in the quiet after battle, when the fires burned low and the stars turned above him, he whispered to himself that his destiny was not only to follow Philip, but to surpass him. The boy had entered the fire of war, and he had come out unbroken. His spirit was stronger, his vision sharper. He was no longer only a student of Aristotle, no longer only a son in Philip's court. He was becoming Alexander, warrior, leader, and heir to a dream greater than Macedon itself. Cleopatra stood at the palace balcony, her eyes fixed upon the harbour of Alexandria. The sea glimmered under the midday sun, dotted with ships that bore foreign standards. Among them, Roman sails towered like watchful eagles, their crimson insignia a reminder that Egypt's destiny was now tied to a distant republic across the Mediterranean. By this time, Cleopatra had been restored to her throne with the help of Julius Caesar. Yet the presence of Rome in Egypt was both salvation and shadow. Alexandria hummed with life. Merchants cried their wares, philosophers argued in the colonnades, perfumers carried jars of myrrh through the crowded streets. But beneath the golden surface, unease spread. The people whispered that Egypt's queen was no longer free, that she had bound herself to a foreign conqueror. Cleopatra felt the sting of those whispers. She had chosen survival, not submission. Yet to rule as a woman in a world of men was to walk upon a razor's edge. She had seen her siblings fall, had watched rivals drown in their own ambitions, and she knew that Egypt could not stand alone against the inexorable tide of Rome. Still, in her heart, she carried the pride of her Ptolemaic bloodline, the divine right to rule as Isis incarnate, the mother and protector of her people. Inside the palace, her infant son cooed in the arms of a nurse. Caesarion, the child of Cleopatra and Caesar, was both blessing and burden. To her, he was proof of her bond with the greatest man in Rome, but to others, he was a dangerous symbol. His very existence threatened Rome's stability, for if Caesarion were recognized as heir, the future of the Roman Republic might belong not to a senator or general, but to a child of Egypt. Cleopatra knew well the dangers such a legacy invited. That year, she traveled with Caesar to Rome. The journey was long, across storm-washed seas and foreign shores, but Cleopatra walked into the Roman capital not as a captive, but as a queen. She dazzled the city with her presence, arriving in splendor, wrapped in silk, and adorned with gold. Her eyes lined in kohl that seemed to pierce the hearts of senators and commoners alike. Rome had never seen a woman like her. Some whispered in awe, others in disdain, calling her a sorceress who had bewitched Caesar. In the marble courtyards of Rome, Cleopatra felt the cold eyes of Caesar's enemies. Senators muttered that she was too bold, too dangerous, a queen who carried Egypt's mysteries and gods into the very heart of their republic. Yet Caesar treated her with honor, hosting her in his villa across the Tiber, parading her as ally rather than vassal. Still, she felt the undercurrents of resentment. Rome tolerated no queen, no rival power, and certainly no foreign child who might claim its future. Cleopatra's time in Rome taught her much. She observed its senators, its generals, its politics dripping with betrayal. She studied the art of survival in a city where daggers lay hidden behind every smile. Most of all, she saw the fragile balance that held Rome together, a balance already trembling under Caesar's ambition. Then came the Ides of March. Cleopatra had sensed the storm before it broke. She had seen the unease in Caesar's face, the rumors that swirled in the air, the senators who moved with too much secrecy. And then the news came, a frenzy of blades in the Senate. Caesar struck down by those he had once called allies. Rome was thrown into chaos, the republic bleeding in the shadow of its greatest general. For Cleopatra, grief was bound with fear. Caesar had been her protector, her partner, her path to Egypt's security. With his death, everything was uncertain. She returned swiftly to Alexandria, carrying her son, knowing that Rome's gaze would turn once again upon her land, and that Egypt's survival would depend not only on strength, but on cunning. Back in her palace, she walked among lotus-filled pools and gilded halls, yet she felt the silence heavy upon her. She knew that Caesar's death did not end her story with Rome. It only deepened it. For even as Caesar fell, new powers were rising: Mark Antony, Octavian, and the struggle that would decide not only Rome's fate, but her own. Cleopatra gazed once more upon the harbor, the sails of Roman ships ever present upon her horizon. She tightened her grip upon the railing, her mind sharpening like a blade. Egypt would not bow easily. She would fight with wit, with beauty, with diplomacy, with the spirit of Isis herself. The Roman tide was rising, and Cleopatra prepared to meet it, head on. The years after Caesar's death rippled with chaos. Rome was fractured, torn between men who claimed his mantle. Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, and Mark Antony, his loyal general, stood at the heart of the storm. The Mediterranean, once Caesar's dominion, was now a battlefield of ambition. For Cleopatra, Egypt stood in perilous balance. She had returned from Rome to find her throne secure, yet fragile. Famine haunted the Nile, pirates plagued the seas, and whispers of rebellion stirred in the desert. But above all, Rome loomed. Whoever seized control of the Republic would inevitably turn their gaze upon Egypt. It was Mark Antony who summoned her first. He called her to Tarsus in Cilicia, demanding that she account for her role during Caesar's civil wars, for her rumored support of his assassins, and to pledge her loyalty. Cleopatra understood the summons well. It was not merely an inquiry, but a test. Rome wished to see whether Egypt's queen would bow or stand. She would stand. When Cleopatra prepared for her journey, she did so with precision and vision. She knew Antony's reputation: brave in battle, reckless in pleasure, a man who adored grandeur and excess as much as he loved conquest. If she came meekly, she would be dismissed. If she came boldly, she might bind him to her. So she conceived a spectacle. Her royal barge sailed up the Cydnus River like a vision from the realm of gods. Its sails were dyed purple, glowing in the sun like Tyrian fire. Silver oars dipped into the waters in perfect rhythm, their strokes timed with the music of flutes and lyres. The air was heavy with incense of myrrh and cinnamon, carried on the breeze so that the very river seemed perfumed. And there, upon the deck, beneath a canopy of gold cloth, reclined Cleopatra. She was dressed not merely as a queen, but as Aphrodite herself, the goddess of love. Her robes shimmered, her jewels caught the sun, and at her side lay servants dressed as cupids, fanning her with peacock feathers. She did not sail to Antony as supplicant, but as divinity incarnate. The people of Tarsus lined the riverbanks, awestruck. Word spread faster than the current, that Egypt's queen had come as goddess, that no mortal woman had ever appeared with such splendor. Antony, seated in the city, was told of her arrival. At first he laughed. He had summoned a queen, and she had answered like a courtesan of the gods. But when he saw her barge gliding to the shore, when he breathed the perfume in the air, when he gazed upon Cleopatra stepping onto the land with the poise of eternity itself, his laughter ceased. He was entranced. That evening, Cleopatra invited him to dine upon her vessel. The banquet was like no other. Tables heaped with roasted peacocks and honeyed figs, cups overflowing with wine, plates of silver and gold. Dancers moved to the sound of drums, the air thick with incense and music. But Cleopatra was the true feast, speaking with wit and charm, weaving tales of Egypt's riches, its gods, its destiny. She did not flatter Antony like others did. She challenged him, teased him, lured him into a realm where he was not commander, but guest in her dominion. Antony, whose life had been filled with soldiers and senators, found himself disarmed. He had known many women, but none like her. She was clever, bold, and radiant with purpose. She did not seek his protection. She offered alliance, the joining of Rome's sword with Egypt's wealth. Yet in every word, every glance, Cleopatra wrapped him tighter in her spell. In the nights that followed, they feasted again and again, Antony attempting to match her in extravagance, and Cleopatra always surpassing him. He prided himself on being larger than life, yet she showed him what true majesty was. Soon, Antony no longer spoke of demanding loyalty. Instead, he promised partnership. Egypt's ships, Egypt's grain, Egypt's gold, all would support him against Octavian. And in return, Antony would be her shield, her champion, her Roman protector. But their alliance was more than politics. In each other, they found a mirror. Cleopatra in Antony's strength and fire, Antony in Cleopatra's brilliance and daring. Their bond was forged in power, but kindled by passion. In Antony's arms, Cleopatra saw not Rome's conqueror, but a man who could burn with her in the same flame. When Cleopatra's barge left Tarsus, she knew the course of her destiny had shifted. With Antony at her side, she could dream of not merely surviving Rome's tide, but shaping it. Yet she also knew that fire, once lit, could illuminate or consume. The goddess of the Nile and the lion of Rome had met. The world would never be the same. The city of Alexandria was alive with a brilliance that dazzled every visitor. Its streets were wide and shaded, lined with colonnades of polished marble, markets overflowing with spices, silks, and jewelry, and fountains that gleamed in the sunlight. The great library, a sanctuary of knowledge, housed scrolls that spoke of every corner of the known world, while the Pharaohs lighthouse towered over the harbour, a beacon guiding ships into the bustling port. When Antony arrived to meet Cleopatra again, it was not merely a political encounter, but a convergence of two forces that seemed destined to reshape history. Alexandria's night skies became witness to the bond they were forging, the city itself illuminated by torches and bonfires, music spilling from the palaces into the streets, and the scent of incense drifting over the Nile. In her royal chambers, Cleopatra awaited him, draped in silk that shimmered like water under the moonlight, adorned with jewels that caught every flicker of candlelight. She embodied both elegance and cunning. She did not merely rule Egypt. She was Egypt, a living incarnation of its power, beauty, and mystique. Antony, seasoned by wars and Roman politics, could not help but be captivated by her presence, feeling simultaneously the thrill of admiration and the tension of danger. Their nights together were filled with strategy and revelry alike. Cleopatra spoke of grain fleets that could sustain armies, of alliances that could shift the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean, and of the wealth that flowed through her kingdom like a river. Antony listened, his Roman mind calculating, yet enchanted, understanding that this queen was not a mere prize to possess, but a partner whose intellect and ambition could match his own. Yet Alexandria was not only a stage for pleasure. Cleopatra and Antony's union ignited intrigue and envy. The courtiers whispered of the Roman general's presence, the citizens watched the queen's audacity, and the ever-watchful Roman Senate observed from afar. Every gesture, every feast, every display of wealth and power carried meaning, signaling alliances, challenges, and warnings. It was in this city, under the warmth of Egyptian nights, that Cleopatra and Antony plotted the extension of their influence. Ships were dispatched to secure territories, envoys sent to negotiate with rulers along the eastern Mediterranean, and Alexandria became the center of a network of power that spanned continents. But alongside strategy, there was also the human pulse. Laughter shared in private gardens, whispered conversations under moonlit balconies, the quiet companionship of two rulers who understood one another in ways no one else could. The city itself seemed to reflect their union. Festivals were held in their honor, lights flickered across the harbor, and the citizens of Alexandria marveled at the grand processions that wove through the streets. Cleopatra's image was everywhere, painted on banners, carved into reliefs, celebrated as the living goddess of her realm. Antony, meanwhile, displayed the might of Rome's legions, a reminder that their bond was not only personal, but political. each feeding the strength of the other. But with fire comes the risk of burn. Even as Cleopatra and Antony's bond deepened, threats loomed. Rome's factions grew restless, gossip spread like wildfire, and the delicate balance of power trembled. Cleopatra knew that their union would be tested not just by love or ambition, but by the relentless tides of history. One misstep could cost her everything: her throne, her kingdom, and the future she had built with Antony. In Alexandria's moonlit gardens, with the Nile whispering below and stars shining above, Cleopatra and Antony made silent vows to one another. They would face Rome together, they would protect Egypt, and they would etch their names into the annals of time. Their alliance was forged in brilliance and danger, a union that would burn brightly and leave a trail of legend across empires. The city slept beneath the stars, unaware of the forces being shaped in its palaces. But the queen and the general knew that history was watching, that every choice, every strategy, and every whisper of romance carried consequences far beyond their walls. And so, with Alexandria as their stage, Cleopatra and Antony prepared to confront the world, their ambitions intertwined as tightly as their hearts. The Mediterranean waters glittered under the relentless sun, a stage for destinies entwined with ships, soldiers, and the weight of empire. Cleopatra's court in Alexandria pulsed with urgency. Every day brought news from the Western world. Octavian, Caesar's heir, gathering strength. Rome, preparing for a confrontation that could shatter kingdoms. The air in the palace was thick with tension, the scent of incense mingling with strategy and fear. Cleopatra knew that Antony was more than a lover. He was the shield of Egypt, the one who could defend the Nile's fertile lands from Rome's ambitious gaze. And yet, even he could not bend destiny. Political rivals whispered in Rome, turning Octavian's mind toward war. The alliance of Cleopatra and Antony, once a symbol of unmatched power and unity, had become a target, a threat to the stability of a republic that would brook no rival to its authority. The preparations were immense. Alexandria sent its ships laden with grain, gold, and soldiers to meet Antony's fleet at the Ionian coast. Antony, seasoned by campaigns from Parthia to the Rhine, organized his legions with precision. Cleopatra oversaw the logistics, her presence both inspirational and commanding. Together they embodied the fusion of Roman discipline and Egyptian opulence, a union that had never been seen before and that many feared would change the world. Yet in the night, Cleopatra felt the weight of uncertainty. She wandered the palace gardens, listening to the distant lapping of the Nile against its stone banks. The wind carried whispers of fate. What if Rome's legions prevailed? What if Antony fell? Her heart, fierce and proud, ached with the knowledge that all she had built, the throne, her son Caesarion, her kingdom, hung on the edge of a knife. The fateful day arrived at Actium, a narrow strait along the western coast of Greece. Two immense fleets faced each other, row upon row of ships, the air heavy with salt, sweat, and tension. Antony's forces were formidable, bolstered by Cleopatra's ships, their sails gilded, their decks alive with soldiers who trusted in the combined might of their leaders. Opposite them, Octavian's fleet, disciplined and numerous, moved with the silent precision of a predator stalking prey. Cleopatra, aboard her royal barge, watched Antony coordinate maneuvers, his commands cutting through the chaos. She understood the stakes as well as he did. The battle was not merely about fleets or soldiers, but about survival, about the future of Egypt and the legacy of their union. Every movement mattered. Every decision carried the weight of kingdoms. As the two forces clashed, the waters became a storm of bronze, wood, and fire. Ships collided, soldiers fought in close quarters, and the cries of men echoed across the waves. Cleopatra's barge glided amidst the chaos, a beacon of strategy and courage. Yet she sensed the tide turning. Antony's fleet, though fierce, began to falter against Octavian's disciplined lines. Morale wavered, and whispers of retreat grew louder among the commanders. In that moment, Cleopatra made a choice. With the courage of a queen and the cunning of a strategist, she signaled her ships to withdraw. Some say she acted to preserve her kingdom, others to protect Antony, but her decision was final. The Egyptian fleet retreated, slipping away into the Ionian Sea, leaving Antony vulnerable. The battle was lost. Antony's forces crumbled, and he too would soon follow, retreating with what remained of his soldiers. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, carrying not only the burden of her survival but the knowledge that the tides of history had shifted. Rome's shadow now loomed larger than ever, and Egypt's fate rested upon her resolve, her intellect, and her courage. Yet, even in defeat, Cleopatra's spirit remained unbroken. She knew that survival was the first step toward triumph, and that Antony, if he lived, could still be her ally, her partner in a struggle that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and ambition. The shadow of Actium had fallen, but the fire of Alexandria, the flame of Cleopatra's vision, burned still, fierce and undimmed, preparing her for the trials yet to come. The harbour of Alexandria gleamed under the late afternoon sun, as Cleopatra, as royal barge, slid silently into the port. The city seemed unchanged. Its marble streets, fountains, and temples stood proud. But Cleopatra knew that beneath the familiar splendor, the world had shifted. The shadow of Rome's victory at Actium loomed heavily, and Egypt's future teetered between survival and subjugation. Cleopatra disembarked with quiet determination. The courtiers and generals who awaited her bowed deeply, aware that their queen had returned not merely as ruler, but as the architect of Egypt's next move. She walked through the city streets with a measured grace, her presence commanding respect even as whispers followed her, some of admiration, others of caution. Every glance, every gesture was calculated to maintain authority in a kingdom that would need all its unity in the days ahead. Inside the palace, Cleopatra convened with her advisors and remaining commanders. Grain reserves, fortifications, and naval vessels were reviewed. Egypt was wealthy, yes, but wealth alone would not protect it. Rome's legions, disciplined and relentless, could sweep across the Mediterranean with ease. She knew that Antony, wounded in spirit and spiritless in resources, could offer little more than moral support. The burden of strategy now rested largely on her shoulders. Yet Cleopatra's mind was far from grim calculation alone. She also considered the people she ruled, the farmers along the Nile, the merchants in the bazaars, the priests in the temples. Each faction needed reassurance. Each needed to feel that the queen's vision would safeguard both tradition and future. Cleopatra moved deftly, balancing diplomacy, military planning, and public perception with a grace that few could match. It was during these days that she also turned her attention to her son, Caesarion. The boy, barely 12, embodied the hope of the dynasty and a symbol to Rome that Egypt's legacy would endure. Cleopatra's tutelage was gentle but firm, instilling in him the knowledge of leadership, the history of his ancestors, and the awareness that every action carried consequences far beyond personal ambition. All the while, Cleopatra watched the sea. The fleet that had once sailed with Antony now lay scattered or captured, but the Mediterranean remained a stage for opportunity. She sent emissaries to distant allies, securing supplies and assurances from kingdoms still wary of Rome. Alexandria became a hive of strategy, a nerve center from which Cleopatra plotted, a city alive with whispers of resilience and defiance. Despite her calm exterior, Cleopatra knew that time was fleeting. Octavian's ambition would not be satiated until Egypt was fully under Roman control. Every day brought reports of troop movements, political intrigues, and the restless whispers of Rome's agents in foreign ports. She needed Antony, but Antony was wounded in pride and in spirit. She needed Rome's divisions, yet Octavian had proven patient and cunning. Cleopatra often walked the terrace overlooking the Nile at dusk, watching the river shimmer under the dying light. Here, away from the advisors and soldiers, she allowed herself the rare moment of reflection. She remembered her first arrival in Rome, the power she had wielded alongside Caesar, the nights of strategy and alliance with Antony, the battles that had tested both courage and loyalty. and she knew that the coming months would demand all of her wit, all of her charm, and all of her courage. In the palace, the courtiers whispered of her beauty, her intelligence, and her unbroken spirit. To some, she was a goddess incarnate. To others, a dangerous queen who had survived Rome's shadow. Cleopatra, however, understood that her fate was not determined by whispers or awe. It was determined by action, by calculation, by daring. As night fell over Alexandria, fires glimmering along the harbor, Cleopatra's resolve hardened. She would rebuild her fleet, secure her alliances, and prepare for the confrontation that history seemed poised to demand. The gathering storm of Rome's ambition approached, and she would meet it not merely with defiance, but with the brilliance and cunning that had carried her through the shadows of uncertainty. The Queen of the Nile had returned, and the world would soon see that Cleopatra's reign was far from over. The sands of time had grown perilous. Cleopatra stood on the terrace of her palace in Alexandria, overlooking the gleaming Nile as it wound toward the Mediterranean. Each ripple of the river seemed to whisper of Rome's inexorable march, of Octavian's growing power, and of the fragile balance between survival and annihilation. Antony had recovered somewhat from Actium, but the shadow of defeat lingered over him like a storm cloud. The generals and soldiers who had survived the disastrous battle were weary, distrustful, and uncertain. Cleopatra understood the magnitude of the task before them: to rebuild forces, to rally allies, and to confront Rome once more, not merely with fleets and armies, but with strategy that matched Octavian's cunning. Her mind moved like a chessboard. Every action had consequence. Every word to an ally, every message sent to distant kingdoms, every display of power in Alexandria was a calculated move in the dangerous game of survival. She summoned her closest advisors, plotting both defense and persuasion, seeking to turn every advantage her way. And Antony, proud, passionate, yet tempered by disaster, stood beside her. Together, they planned a final gambit, a campaign that could either restore their strength or seal their doom. Cleopatra's ships, resupplied and reinforced, were ready to sail. Troops were marshaled, supplies stockpiled, and messengers dispatched to loyal kings along the Mediterranean shores. Yet even in the midst of planning, Cleopatra sensed the human frailty within Antony, the man whose heart she had captivated and whose loyalty she had relied upon. The tension between love and politics sharpened every day. Cleopatra, regal and commanding, navigated the dangerous interplay of romance, ambition, and survival. Antony, fierce and reckless, was driven by loyalty to her and the desire to maintain his own honor and power. Together, they were a formidable force, yet the world around them was unforgiving, a stage where a single misstep could collapse empires. As the Mediterranean sun rose over the horizon, they embarked on their final campaign. The sea shimmered, their ships cutting through the waves, carrying men trained to fight, to die, to serve. Alexandria faded behind them, a glittering memory of power and opulence, while ahead lay the unknown, the confrontation that would define both their lives and the destiny of Egypt. The final gambit was not merely a battle of fleets, but of minds, wills, and the unyielding force of fate. Cleopatra and Antony knew the stakes. Their kingdoms, their legacies, and the lives of those they led depended on courage, cunning, and the bond they shared. Each maneuver, each decision, carried the weight of history, and each heartbeat echoed with the tension of inevitable confrontation. The shadow of Rome loomed large. Octavian, ever vigilant, had anticipated their movements, and his forces were poised to strike with precision. Cleopatra, unyielding, met this challenge not with despair, but with the poise and brilliance that had defined her reign. Every plan, every alliance, every calculated risk was part of a vision: to preserve Egypt, to defend Antony, and to confront Rome on terms as favorable as fate would allow. In those tense days, Cleopatra's spirit burned with the fire of determination. She moved with regal authority among her captains, her officers, and her people, reminding all that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Queen of the Nile would not bow. The final gambit had begun, and history watched, holding its breath, as Cleopatra and Antony prepared to confront destiny itself. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly before them, waves glittering like molten silver, a canvas upon which the final act of their power, love, and defiance would unfold. Alexandria might lie behind, but the fate of empires rested ahead, and Cleopatra, as ever, faced it with unflinching resolve. The battle had been long in planning, but its outcome unfolded with devastating swiftness. The waters near Actium, once the stage for Cleopatra and Antony's boldest gambit, now bore witness to their unraveling. Octavian's forces, disciplined and numerous, had anticipated every maneuver, every tactic, every hope the queen and her general had placed in the sea and the wind. Antony's fleet, though valiant, began to falter. Ships collided in confusion, crews grew weary, and the morale of men who had once trusted in their leader's invincibility cracked under the pressure. Cleopatra, aboard her flagship, watched the unfolding chaos with eyes sharp as a hawk's. She understood the stakes. The loss of this battle meant not just defeat, but the collapse of the alliance that had safeguarded Egypt. Then came the turning point. Cleopatra, ever calculated and daring, ordered her ships to withdraw, moving swiftly toward the open sea. Some say she acted to preserve Egypt, others to save her own life, but Antony interpreted the move as abandonment. Panic rippled through his ranks, courage gave way to confusion, and the Roman forces pressed the advantage relentlessly. Antony, wounded in pride and spirit, realized too late that his own fleet had been divided, his forces broken, and his hope of victory slipping like water through his fingers. He attempted to regroup, to rally his men, but the tide of fortune had turned decisively against him. Every maneuver was met with resistance, every command met with hesitation, and the once feared general of Rome found himself powerless against Octavian's precision. News reached Cleopatra, even as she sailed towards safety. Antony had retreated to the shore, his remaining forces scattered, his spirit near collapse. The weight of loss pressed upon her chest, a cold reminder that brilliance and courage were not always enough against the unyielding sweep of history. She grieved not only for Antony's defeat, but for the consequences it would bring to their kingdom, to their people, and to the son she cherished, Caesarion. When Antony returned to Alexandria, broken and defeated, Cleopatra met him with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had survived, yet the world had shifted irreversibly. Octavian's shadow now stretched fully across the Mediterranean, and the dream of alliance and empire they had nurtured together was crumbling beneath the weight of Rome's relentless ambition. In the quiet of the palace, far from the eyes of soldiers and citizens, Antony and Cleopatra confronted the reality of their situation. Their bond, forged in brilliance, passion, and mutual respect, could not alter the relentless advance of Octavian. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, began to weave plans for survival, for negotiation, for preservation, not merely of her life, but of Egypt's sovereignty. Antony, proud yet humbled, recognized that their fates were bound and that the coming days would demand courage, cunning, and the acceptance of limits even the greatest warriors could not surpass. Alexandria itself seemed to mourn with them. The city's streets were alive with whispers of uncertainty. The Nile reflected the blood-orange sunsets of a kingdom poised on the edge of irrevocable change, and every temple, every column, every statue seemed to echo the knowledge that history was being rewritten. Cleopatra's resolve, however, remained unbroken. She would confront Octavian not only with dignity, but with the intelligence and audacity that had defined her reign. The fall of Antony marked a turning point, a moment when hope faltered, yet strategy and cunning became paramount. Cleopatra's mind, sharp and unyielding, turned toward the final challenge: survival, legacy, and the preservation of the kingdom that had nurtured her rise. The tide had shifted, but the Queen of the Nile was far from defeated. The sun rose over Alexandria, burning gold across the waters of the harbor. The city, once bustling with traders, scholars, and priests, now seemed tense and silent, its streets holding their breath for the coming storm. Octavian's legions approached, disciplined, merciless, and unstoppable. Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, stood atop the palace walls, her gaze steady, her mind alight with strategy and determination. She had prepared for this moment. Every palace chamber had been stocked with treasures, every fleet and garrison organized for defense, every citizen aware that the survival of Egypt rested on their courage and loyalty. Cleopatra's plan was not simply to fight, it was to negotiate, to maneuver, to outwit a man whose power was vast, yet whose vision could be challenged. Antony had fought valiantly in the prior months, yet his forces were diminished, his morale weakened. The queen understood that the final confrontation would require more than armies. It would require the intellect, charisma, and daring that had defined her reign. She summoned her advisors, generals, and trusted confidants, reviewing every option: fight, flee, parley, or a combination of all. The city itself seemed to brace for the inevitable. Markets were shuttered, temples rang with the prayers of priests invoking Isis and Horus, and the citizens whispered of the fate of their queen. Cleopatra moved among them, a symbol of defiance, reminding all that she was both protector and ruler, strategist and sovereign. Her presence alone inspired courage. When Octavian arrived, his banners flapping in the warm wind, Cleopatra did not falter. She met his envoys with poise and intelligence, negotiating, probing, and presenting a front of dignity and strength. Every word was measured, every gesture deliberate. She knew that Rome respected cunning, and that appearances could shape perception as much as armies could shape battlefields. Yet the tide of history was relentless. Antony, in despair at the unfolding circumstances, chose to confront Octavian in a final, tragic confrontation. Cleopatra watched from the palace, her heart torn between love, loyalty, and the stark reality of their dwindling options. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Antony's forces, though brave, could not match Octavian's discipline. The Roman legions pressed forward and Antony fell, leaving Cleopatra alone to face the empire that had conquered all before her. Alone, Cleopatra stood amidst the treasures and symbols of Egypt, her mind racing with possibilities. She understood that submission to Octavian would mean not only the loss of her throne, but the erasure of Egypt's independence and her legacy. She sought a path that would preserve dignity, protect her son Caesarion, and ensure that Egypt's story would endure beyond her lifetime. In the quiet of her chamber, Cleopatra made the choice that would define her legend. She would not bow to Octavian. She would not survive merely as a shadow of Rome. Instead, she would meet history on her own terms, embracing her destiny as a queen who shaped her final moments with courage, intelligence, and an unbroken spirit. The city of Alexandria, silent under the gaze of the approaching legions, became the stage for Cleopatra's last stand. She moved with grace among her attendants, commanding respect, issuing orders, and preparing for the end with the poise of a ruler whose life had been defined by brilliance, daring, and unyielding resolve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Nile in hues of fire and gold, Cleopatra's eyes shone with a mixture of determination and serenity. She knew the world would remember her not merely for battles lost or won, but for the courage, intelligence, and vision with which she had ruled, loved, and faced the inexorable sweep of history. The Queen of the Nile, alone yet unbroken, prepared to etch her final act into eternity. The palace of Alexandria was hushed, its corridors heavy with the scent of incense and the tension of inevitability. Cleopatra walked through the halls, her steps measured, her mind clear. The city outside was filled with soldiers and whispers. Rome's legions had taken control, yet within the queen's chambers, she remained sovereign in spirit, commanding every thought, every decision, every heartbeat. Her gaze fell upon Caesarion, her young son, sleeping peacefully. He was the living testament of her alliance with Julius Caesar, the hope of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the symbol of Egypt's enduring legacy. Protecting him had been her guiding purpose through years of alliance, war, and intrigue. She knew that even if she fell, Caesarion could carry forward the lineage of a queen who had defied empires and shaped history with intelligence and courage. Octavian's envoys pressed for her submission, their words polite yet filled with threat. Cleopatra listened, her voice calm and measured, her expression regal. She refused to yield not out of pride alone, but out of understanding that her dignity and the honor of Egypt were paramount. Rome may have conquered fleets, armies, and territories, but it could not conquer the mind of Cleopatra. In the quiet moments she reflected on her life, the Nile that had nurtured her, the palaces and temples that had witnessed her rise, the gardens where she had met Antony under moonlit skies, the halls of Rome where she had dazzled Caesar. Every victory, every challenge, every love and loss had led to this moment. And she would meet it as she had met all others, with courage, clarity, and calculated resolve. Word came that Antony, her partner in both love and empire, had succumbed to despair, unable to bear the weight of defeat. Cleopatra grieved not only for him, but for the life they had dreamed of together, a life where Egypt and Rome might have coexisted under their guidance, a future of alliance and mutual respect. His death left her alone, yet she refused to let despair dictate her actions. Cleopatra summoned her attendants, her loyal guards, and prepared herself for the final act. Ancient sources say she embraced the symbolism of her heritage, aligning herself with Isis, the goddess of magic, fertility, and life. She would meet death as she had lived, with dignity, intelligence, and the awareness that history watches those who dare to define their own destiny. When the moment came, she did not flee. She did not plead. Cleopatra chose the manner of her passing carefully, ensuring that it reflected the sovereignty she had wielded her entire life. The Queen of the Nile, who had once commanded empires, navigated diplomacy, love, and war with unmatched brilliance, now stepped into eternity with control over her final act. The city of Alexandria mourned, the Nile flowing silently beneath the stars, reflecting the memory of a queen whose life had been extraordinary. Cleopatra's death marked the end of both an era and a dynasty, yet it also ensured the immortality of her legend. Egypt would no longer be ruled by a Ptolemaic queen, but the story of Cleopatra, her intelligence, her daring, her passion, and her unyielding courage would live on for millennia. In the wake of her passing, Octavian consolidated power, and Rome absorbed Egypt as a province. Yet even as the empire grew, Cleopatra's influence endured, in tales whispered along the Nile, in Rome's own history, in the hearts and minds of those who marveled at a queen who had loved, fought, and ruled with unparalleled mastery. The end of Cleopatra's life was not merely an end. It was a testament to the power of intellect, vision, and resolve. She had faced empires, lovers, and destiny itself, and she had done so on her own terms. In the annals of history, her name would be remembered, not just for beauty or romance, but for a life lived with brilliance and an unbroken spirit that defied the tides of time. The city of Alexandria, now under Roman control, shimmered with the golden glow of an empire asserting its dominance. Markets reopened, temples stood silent yet proud, and the Nile flowed steadily, as it had for millennia, a witness to the rise and fall of kings and queens. Yet, amid the calm and the grandeur, the memory of Cleopatra lingered, like a current beneath the surface, shaping the hearts and minds of those who remembered her reign. Cleopatra's influence extended far beyond her death. Her son, Caesarion, had perished under Rome's watchful eye, yet the stories of her intelligence, courage, and political acumen traveled across continents. Scholars in Alexandria wrote of her knowledge of languages, mathematics, and astronomy. Poets and artists depicted her beauty, charisma, and command, and leaders across the Mediterranean studied the strategies she employed to navigate a world dominated by men. Egypt, though absorbed into the Roman Empire, retained the echoes of her rule. The temples and monuments she had restored and adorned, remained symbols of cultural pride. Her patronage of learning, arts, and architecture had cemented Alexandria as a hub of civilization. The library, the Pharaohs lighthouse, and the palaces she had rebuilt became enduring symbols of the city's brilliance. Even Rome, often dismissive of foreign rulers, could not erase the lessons taught by Cleopatra's life, her diplomacy, her mastery of alliances, and her ability to command loyalty through both intellect and presence. Her story, passed down through generations, inspired rulers, scholars, and dreamers alike. Cleopatra became not merely a figure of history, but a symbol of the intersection of power, intelligence, and audacity. She demonstrated that a woman could govern a kingdom, influence empires, and shape destiny through wit and courage, leaving an indelible mark on the world. In the hearts of Egyptians, she remained a goddess incarnate, a queen who had walked among mortals yet commanded respect, as if she belonged to a divine lineage. Festivals and rituals continued to honor her memory, and her life was recounted in whispers along the Nile, in Alexandria's marketplaces, and within the halls of scholars who preserved the knowledge she had championed. Rome, too, felt her legacy. Octavian, later Augustus, understood that Cleopatra's influence had altered the course of history. He secured Egypt, but he could not erase the memory of a queen who had commanded love and loyalty, who had challenged Rome itself, and who had faced the unstoppable tide of history with intelligence and dignity. Across centuries, Cleopatra's life became a bridge between worlds, Egypt and Rome, East and West, myth and history. Her story resonated not only for its romance or tragedy, but for the demonstration of leadership, strategy, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She had lived fully, loved passionately, and ruled wisely, leaving behind a legacy that would echo in every era that sought to understand power, sovereignty, and the human spirit. The Nile continued to flow, unchanging yet eternal, carrying the memory of Cleopatra with it. In every ripple, every reflection of the sun upon its waters, there remained the mark of a queen who had defied conventions, shaped empires, and left an enduring imprint on the world. Her life had ended, yet her story endured, eternal as the river she had ruled beside. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, had achieved immortality, not through conquest alone, but through brilliance, courage, and the enduring influence of a queen who had lived on her own terms. Long after the marble columns of Alexandria had been worn by wind and time, and after Rome had transformed Egypt into a province of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, the memory of Cleopatra endured. She became more than a queen. She became a story, a symbol, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration woven into the tapestry of history. Bards in distant lands sang of the queen whose beauty could captivate emperors and whose intellect could command armies. Scholars debated her strategies, her diplomacy, and her knowledge of languages, science, and philosophy. Artists painted her likeness in flowing silks and jewel-studded crowns, capturing not just her visage, but the aura of authority that had defined her presence. Cleopatra became the embodiment of ambition, intelligence, and grace, immortalized in both triumph and tragedy. In Alexandria, whispers of her deeds persisted along the Nile. Mothers told their children of the queen, who had ruled with wisdom and courage, who had faced the greatest empire of the world and refused to bow. Temples that she had adorned continued to draw pilgrims, not merely as places of worship, but as reminders of a sovereign who had shaped history with her own hands. Even Rome, which had claimed her kingdom, could not escape her shadow. Emperors and senators remembered the lessons of her diplomacy, her ability to sway opinion, and her unwavering will. Cleopatra had altered the course of their world, leaving imprints on political thought and the understanding of leadership that would endure long after her death. Through the centuries, poets, playwrights, and historians grappled with her story. She became a figure of fascination in literature and legend, sometimes portrayed as a seductress, sometimes as a strategic genius, always as a woman whose life transcended ordinary limits. Shakespeare's pen would later capture the allure and tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra. But even his works could not contain the full depth of her life, her intellect, or her courage. Cleopatra's legacy extended beyond legend and art. She had reshaped the perception of women in power, showing that intelligence, diplomacy, and decisiveness could rival armies and empires. Her life inspired rulers, thinkers, and dreamers alike, a reminder that the impact of one individual, guided by vision and resolve, could ripple across time. The Nile continued its eternal course, whispering stories of empires and kings, of battles and alliances, and of a queen who had dared to meet destiny head-on. Cleopatra's name remained etched not only in stone, but in the collective memory of civilizations, a testament to a life lived with brilliance, passion, and an unyielding spirit. History remembers Cleopatra not merely as a queen, not merely as a lover or a ruler, but as a force of nature whose life illuminated the complexities of power, the depth of human ambition, and the enduring strength of intellect and courage. Her story is a bridge across millennia, a reminder that greatness is not measured solely by conquest, but by the audacity to shape one's destiny and leave a mark that defies time. Even now, centuries later, travelers along the Nile imagine her presence, her gaze steady, her mind sharp, her spirit unbroken. Cleopatra endures as a legend, a historical force, and an eternal symbol of a life that was lived fully, boldly, and without compromise. Long after the dust of empires had settled and the Mediterranean kingdoms had been reshaped by Rome, Cleopatra's life remained a lesson in courage, intelligence, and leadership. Scholars and rulers studied her strategies, her diplomacy, and her unparalleled ability to navigate a world dominated by men, seeing in her life a blueprint for resilience and vision. Cleopatra had taught that true power lay not only in armies or wealth, but in understanding the hearts and minds of people. She had mastered languages, science, philosophy, and politics, realizing that intellect and insight could sway even the most formidable adversaries. Her reign illustrated that influence is as much about wisdom as it is about authority, and that perception often carries as much weight as action. Her story also offered lessons in courage and dignity. Even when confronted by the might of Rome, she met destiny with composure, strategic foresight, and unwavering pride. She understood that surrender, while often the easiest path, could never preserve honor or legacy. Cleopatra's life became a testament to the idea that the manner in which one faces challenges can define one's place in history more than the outcomes themselves. Love, too, was entwined with her leadership. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not merely personal. They were political acts carefully calibrated to strengthen her kingdom. Cleopatra demonstrated that emotional intelligence, loyalty, and connection could complement strategy, shaping the course of empires while humanizing leadership. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson was the enduring nature of legacy. Cleopatra had faced a world intent on erasing her, a Roman Empire eager to rewrite the story of Egypt. And yet, through intellect, artistry, and sheer force of presence, she ensured that her story would outlive the walls of palaces and the reach of armies. Her life reminds leaders, thinkers, and dreamers that the impact of vision and courage can ripple across centuries. Artists and writers drew inspiration from her audacity. Statesmen studied her negotiation tactics. Women across the ages found in her a model of leadership and independence. Cleopatra's life, both tragic and brilliant, became a guide for those who seek to balance power with wisdom, ambition with integrity, and action with reflection. The Nile flowed on, a silent witness to centuries of history. Cleopatra's influence coursed along with its waters, carrying lessons of strategy, resilience, intellect, and courage. Every empire that rose or fell, every leader who studied her life, and every historian who chronicled her deeds contributed to the enduring story of a queen who had dared to shape destiny on her own terms. In every reflection of the river, in every tale of empires and alliances, in every whisper of history, Cleopatra's lessons remained alive. She taught that greatness is not inherited, It is forged through intelligence, courage, and the relentless pursuit of vision. And in that pursuit, a queen of Egypt had left a mark upon the world that would never fade. Centuries passed, yet Cleopatra's name continued to echo across lands, seas, and generations. Historians chronicled her life with admiration and intrigue. Poets wove her deeds into tales of love and tragedy, and artists sought to capture the essence of a queen whose life had defied the ordinary. The facts of her reign intertwined with legend, creating a figure both real and larger than life, a symbol of ambition, beauty, intelligence, and indomitable spirit. Her story became a canvas upon which each generation painted its own interpretation. Some celebrated her as the ultimate strategist, a ruler whose intellect shaped kingdoms and swayed emperors. Others focused on her romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, seeing in Cleopatra the power of love entwined with political acumen. Yet every depiction, every tale, carried a common thread. She was exceptional, a force of history who could not be contained by time, geography, or circumstance. In literature, from ancient chronicles to Renaissance drama, Cleopatra's persona evolved. She was the embodiment of human complexity, wise yet passionate, proud yet vulnerable, strategic yet capable of deep emotional connection. Shakespeare's tragedy immortalized her as a queen of paradoxes, a woman whose choices shaped nations, and whose life inspired awe, fear, and fascination. Through story, her essence traveled far beyond Alexandria, embedding itself in the cultural imagination of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Even in modern times, Cleopatra's myth thrives. Films, novels, paintings, and scholarship continue to explore her life, drawing lessons from her intellect, ambition, and courage. She remains a figure who challenges stereotypes, redefining perceptions of female leadership, and demonstrating that influence and power are not confined by gender or circumstance. Her image, both historical and legendary, stands as a reminder of the enduring power of identity and presence. Cleopatra's brilliance was not merely in her physical beauty or political alliances, but in her ability to shape perception, inspire loyalty, and navigate the currents of power with grace and insight. Across millennia, she has remained a symbol of resilience and audacity, of intelligence harmonized with passion, and of leadership tempered by wisdom. The Nile still flows, carrying whispers of her legacy. Alexandria's ruins testify to a civilization that flourished under her reign. And in the imagination of the world, Cleopatra continues to live, not as a distant figure of the past, but as an eternal emblem of the capacity of a single life to leave an indelible mark on history. Through myth and memory, Cleopatra transcends mortality. She is remembered not only as the last pharaoh of Egypt, but as an enduring idea that courage, intelligence, and vision can defy time itself. Her legend, intertwined with the river she ruled beside, continues to inspire, captivate, and challenge humanity, reminding all who hear her story that greatness is forged through brilliance, daring, and the refusal to submit to the ordinary. Even millennia after her death, Cleopatra's life continues to teach lessons about leadership, courage, and the human spirit. Her story, preserved in historical records, literature, and art, transcends the boundaries of time and culture, offering insight into the enduring nature of power and influence. Cleopatra demonstrated that true leadership requires intelligence, adaptability, and emotional awareness. She navigated a world dominated by empires and men, balancing diplomacy, strategy, and personal alliances to protect her kingdom and her people. Her ability to speak multiple languages, understand complex political landscapes, and engage directly with allies and adversaries alike set a standard for rulers across history. Her life also illustrates the intertwined nature of personal and political decisions. The alliances she formed with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were as much about survival and strategy as they were about affection. In every decision, Cleopatra weighed the stakes, understanding that her choices affected not only her own fate, but the destiny of Egypt and her people. Moreover, Cleopatra's story underscores the significance of legacy. Even when Rome absorbed Egypt and the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, her influence endured. She left behind a model of sovereignty and vision that inspired writers, artists, and leaders for centuries. Cleopatra teaches that the measure of a life is not merely in victories or possessions, but in the impact one leaves on the world. The courage to face impossible odds and the ability to remain steadfast in identity and purpose. Modern leaders and thinkers often look to Cleopatra as a case study in negotiation, strategy, and charisma. Her life exemplifies how intellect and personal presence can shape events as profoundly as armies and wealth. She reminds us that women, historically underestimated in spheres of power, can wield authority with brilliance, grace, and decisive action. Yet beyond politics and strategy, Cleopatra's story resonates on a deeply human level. It is a story of love and loss, ambition and tragedy, resilience and wisdom. Her life shows that even in the face of overwhelming forces, dignity, courage, and foresight can guide one's choices. She met history on her own terms, forging a path that remains awe-inspiring to anyone who studies her life. Across time and cultures, Cleopatra's life continues to spark curiosity, admiration, and reflection. She challenges us to consider the complexities of leadership, the nuances of influence, and the power of intellect and character. Her enduring presence in history is a testament to the capacity of one individual to shape not only the destiny of a kingdom, but the imagination of generations. In the quiet moments of history, long after the Nile had flowed through kingdoms both conquered and forgotten, Cleopatra's presence lingered like a river of memory, flowing through the minds of those who studied her life. She became more than a queen. She was a mirror reflecting the possibilities of leadership, courage, and vision. Scholars pored over her life, noting how she had mastered the art of diplomacy, navigating a world dominated by Rome while preserving Egypt's culture, wealth, and identity. Her ability to forge alliances, to negotiate, and to inspire loyalty remains a model for rulers and thinkers. She demonstrated that authority is not only a matter of armies or gold, but of intelligence, perception, and the ability to understand human nature. Cleopatra's story also embodies the balance between ambition and humanity. She was strategic, calculated, and sometimes ruthless, yet she also loved deeply, grieved openly, and understood the fragility of life. Antony's death, the loss of her son, and the fall of her kingdom were personal tragedies that intertwined with her political challenges, reminding us that even the most powerful are not immune to sorrow or fate. Her reflection on life, as preserved in legend and history, reminds us that leadership is inseparable from responsibility. Every choice carried weight, every action rippled across kingdoms. Cleopatra's intellect and insight were her weapons, her understanding of people her shield. She faced adversaries who wielded legions and wealth, yet she held her own through cunning, charm, and unwavering confidence. Even as Rome absorbed Egypt, Cleopatra's cultural and political influence endured. Her reign fostered the growth of Alexandria as a center of knowledge and art. Temples, libraries, and palaces flourished under her guidance, leaving a tangible mark on civilization. Through these achievements, she ensured that Egypt would not merely be a conquered province, but a symbol of enduring intellect, culture, and sovereignty. The reflections of her life also extend to the lessons for the modern world. Cleopatra embodies the intersection of intellect, strategy, and empathy. She teaches the importance of foresight, adaptability, and resilience. Her story encourages leaders to consider both the practical and human dimensions of power, to recognize the influence of legacy, and to act with clarity and conviction in the face of uncertainty. In art, literature, and memory, Cleopatra remains a beacon. She challenges perceptions, inspires courage, and invites admiration, not solely for her beauty, but for her mind, her vision, and her ability to navigate a world that often sought to underestimate her. The life of Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, continues to reflect the eternal struggle between ambition, and destiny, reminding humanity that greatness is defined not only by power, but by how it is wielded. The sun set over Alexandria one final time under Cleopatra's reign, casting long shadows across the palaces and temples that had witnessed centuries of Egypt's glory. Though her life ended, the essence of Cleopatra flowed onward, like the Nile itself, timeless, unyielding, and eternal. Cleopatra's choices, her courage, her intellect, and her audacity had shaped not only her own destiny, but the course of history. The fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty marked the end of an era, yet the spirit of her reign endured in every stone, every whisper, and every story carried along the river she had loved. The city she ruled became a testament to her vision, a center of learning, culture, and art that echoed her brilliance long after her passing. Her death did not erase her influence. Rome absorbed Egypt, yet Cleopatra's legacy transcended political boundaries. Leaders, scholars, and dreamers across the centuries studied her life, learning from her diplomacy, her strategy, and her resilience. She became a symbol not of defeat, but of the power of vision and intellect to confront the greatest challenges. In literature, art, and performance, Cleopatra remained immortal. Her love, her alliances, her triumphs, and her tragedies became stories retold in every age. Shakespeare, historians, poets, and modern filmmakers alike sought to capture her complexity. A ruler whose beauty was matched only by her brilliance, whose passion was tempered by wisdom, and whose courage remained unwavering in the face of overwhelming odds. But beyond legend, Cleopatra's life continues to offer lessons for all generations. She teaches that leadership is not only about command or conquest, but about understanding, empathy, and foresight. That influence is forged not merely through force, but through intellect, communication, and the ability to inspire loyalty and respect. That legacy is not inherited. It is created through every decision, every challenge met with clarity and purpose, every act of courage that defies expectation. The Nile flows on, carrying her memory across time, through civilizations, and into the hearts of those who study history. Cleopatra's life reminds us that even as empires rise and fall, and even as kingdoms crumble, the impact of one individual, defined by vision, courage, and brilliance, can endure forever. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, yet her story, her lessons, and her legend remain eternal, like the river itself. And so, Cleopatra lives on, not merely in history books, but in the human imagination, a queen whose life defied ordinary limits, whose intellect shaped empires, and whose spirit, indomitable and eternal, continues to inspire all who seek to understand the power, the glory, and the enduring mystery of a life fully lived